Podcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Hey everybody, I'm Patrick Barra, and thank you for joining me on another episode of Learning from Leaders. On this episode, we're going to be talking about leadership in the auto industry, and specifically, we're going to be talking with David Welch, who's the author of a book called Charging Ahead, General Motors' Mary Barra, and the Reinvention of an American Icon. And it does a great job. There's some fantastic stories in here of Mary Barra's rise to becoming CEO of GM, and just a great conversation with David. So let's get into it. David, I want to thank you for taking the time to be on the podcast today. This is one of those books. I haven't read a lot about the auto industry, but as I mentioned before we started here, my dad was a salesman in the auto industry his entire life, and I'm the youngest of 10, and he supported our family by himself for many of those years. I have a lot of respect for him, and I told you about our story that we were close to the dealership, and we had gremlins parked in our driveway when they had an overflow of cars coming in for deliveries. I loved the opportunity to talk to you about Mary in this book that you've written, really about her, and I think where the industry is going. So thank you for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me on, Patrick. And your story is similar to where a lot of people who've read the book have said to me that, and these are people outside the auto industry, they've just been touched by the industry in one way or another. They worked in it, or their parents worked in it, or they just love cars, or they're fascinated by this move to electric vehicles. But that's why I thought it was an important book to write, because you've got this iconic company that was the biggest, the best auto company in the world, actually the best company of any kind for a period of time. And they had this terrible reckoning and failure and rebirth. And she's kind of on this mission to bring it back to greatness, or at least really goodness. And I think it's an important story because of the way the auto industry does touch so many people in terms of jobs and passion for vehicles themselves and all that.
Yeah. And for you, though, people might be wondering that are listening, why is David Welch telling the story? You really had a unique seat at the table for a lot of this. So I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit of background in terms of really your relationship to the industry as a writer, and then your following of this whole progress of Mary Barra.
Sure. So I've been covering the auto industry kind of on and off for longer than I care to admit, probably 25 years. I've left for a couple of assignments. I've covered Wall Street in New York for a few years, covered Walmart and consumer products business for a brief period of time, but probably late 90s started covering the industry, first in Texas for the Forward Star Telegram, later for the Detroit News. And I was the bureau chief for Business Week in Detroit. And that's where I was really covering the GM story. And during that era, that was the 2000s, we covered the failure, this glide path into bankruptcy, the company which was caused by financial issues and past management mistakes and cultural stupidity, let's call it. So I covered the bankruptcy and the rebirth. And then Bloomberg News bought Business Week magazine. So I went over to Bloomberg. I've been the Detroit bureau chief there for 7 years. And I've covered this kind of rebirth and this move to electric vehicles. I've seen GM from the days when they were melting down in the 90s, but didn't really quite understand that. And then when they really did melt down, and this attempt to create a new GM, which is what Mary Barra is really trying to do. And she too grew up with the company. Her father was a die maker in Pontiac when they used to have tens of thousands of General Motors employees in Pontiac, and now there aren't any. Her story with GM, she grew up with this company through all phases as well.
Now, when did you become interested with her story?
When she was named head of product development, I was leaving the beat. I was there to cover that story. And she was the first. The reason that was significant is she was the first woman to become a head of product development at a car company. It's always been a very macho domain. You've got the designers there, the artsy guys, but you have a bunch of engineers. A lot of them are into racing. They have gasoline in their veins. They've got just a passion for vehicles, for driving. And you just didn't have a lot of female engineers traditionally. I think when she studied electrical engineering at General Motors Institute, which is now called Kettering University, I think her professor told me it was 90% men. And then she was there in the, late early 80s, I think. And she gets that job, and that was kind of a big deal. I left to go to New York and cover Wall Street for a while. And when I came back, she was in the process of becoming CEO. So I came back to Detroit to cover the company and cover the industry right when she was being named to the top job. And that was a huge deal because there'd never been a female CEO of an auto company anywhere in the world. And for a lot of the same reasons, it was this kind of macho industry where they call the top executives car guys, not car gals, not car women, not car people, car guys. And she sort of turned all that on its head.
Now, her predecessor, Dan Ackerson, I would think, as you read about it in the book, really had a lot to do with her. Obviously, she earned her own space, but he saw something in her, right? He ran with it.
He did, yeah. Dan gave me a lot of time for the book, as you see when you read it. He was appalled by a lot of what he saw at GM. He thought there was despite the fact that the company had gone bankrupt a couple of years before he got there or became CEO, thought there was still a lot of complacency, a lot of arrogance, a lot of this thinking that there'd always be a GM and they were just entitled to this position as largest auto company in the world. And no matter how good or badly they performed, they would just always find a way out of the trouble. And he didn't see a high performance culture there. And he thought she really got it, that she wasn't part of the old entitled crowd. She was more sleeves up, more pragmatic. And she realized that they really had to change how they did business, how they managed, and how they developed products if the company was going to succeed and if there was going to be a successful new era of General Motors.
And it seems, right, her dad was in the industry, that she also had some street cred in terms of, and I think some real passion for wanting to see this organization succeed.
She did. I think what gave her some credibility internally when she was getting these top jobs was she came up, even though she was an electrical engineer, she came up through manufacturing. So not the product development side of the business, but as one executive put it, the earthiest part of automaking. John Smith, former executive, said it was this automaking is this orchestration of men and machines down on the plant floor. And so she managed plants, and then later she was a manufacturing engineer. So her job was to get vehicles from the engineering and design studios to the assembly line and then manage the workers on the line. And those can be pretty rough and tumble places. The thing is, though, when she became head of product development, I had people I knew for years at the company saying to me, she's never been in product development before. She was in human resources after manufacturing. What does she know about this? So there was a lot of sniping, actually. And now part of that probably is because she's a woman. Part of that probably also was she'd come out of HR. Nobody likes people in HR in any company. Typically, that's when you get a call from HR, they're either firing you or cutting your benefits. I think that was part of it. The other thing was, you remember during bankruptcy, which was 2009, the Treasury Department took over the company and swept out an entire generation of managers. Then you had a lot of people who went from, say, mid to upper level, now had an open look at top jobs. I think there was probably a lot of jockeying and a lot of wondering who's going to go where. And you get this woman who was in manufacturing and HR suddenly running product development and then running the company. And I think maybe there were some jealousies and these political fights within companies get petty. There was some sniping about that. But she did have credibility. The fact she was an engineer and previous management had all come from finance.
In that she spoke, from what I was reading through that, is that there was a respect that she wasn't playing the game the way other people were. She was going to call it as she saw it.
She did. And to her credit, though, she has a very polite and professional way of doing it. She's good at building relationships. She can be a bit aloof with the media, but I think she is very direct, but it's not in a harsh way typically. And I'm sure there are moments when she has to do that, but when she addresses the entire company, employees tell me she's really good at that, at conveying what the mission is, what the message is, while making no mistake that, hey, this is the way we're going. And if it's not for you, then you can leave.
Along those lines, it seems like that approach or her approach allowed people to talk about problems that were going on within the organization that maybe they didn't feel that they could before because you put yourself in jeopardy to do that. Yeah,
I think so. We've seen this. We saw it at Ford years ago, too, when Alan Mulally took over. I think with both of these managers, one thing they had in common is they want to know what the problems are. They don't want people sweeping things under the rug. And at car companies, I think probably with a lot of big companies, actually, if you come into a meeting with a bunch of other upper-level executives from various disciplines and you admit that there's a problem in yours, it's a sign that maybe you screwed up and you need somebody else's help. And nobody wants to do that. And Alan Mulally used to hammer people for hiding things. That's not Mary Barra's style, but she did want to know immediately when something was wrong. They could go about fixing it. She told me once that problems don't get better the longer you sit around and wait for something to happen. They only get worse. So you've got to move quickly on these things, and you need information to do it.
It was interesting. I was going to ask you about the Al Mulally. Now, this is years ago. I remember reading a case study on him in some of my leadership work around one of these events where he was in a meeting and somebody had mentioned there was a problem with a hatch that they were going to have to recall. Is that the story?
It was a meeting with, I think it was Consumer Reports. And so there were a couple of Ford engineers or people who dealt with quality there. And I think it was the Ford Escape. Oh, no, it wasn't the Escape. I think it was the Ford Edge crossover SUV. And one of the complaints was that when the hatch was all the way up, women couldn't reach it to close it. I should say people under a certain height, because there can be men who are, I think the height was 5'4". There can be 5'4" men. Anyway, the engineers start explaining to Consumer Reports why this is really great engineering and it's not a problem. Something to that. I'm probably hyperbolizing, but it's something to that effect. And Wally went over, got some pencils and a couple of notebooks off the table, and he handed it to the guys.
Yeah. As part of one of those other stories, now whether it's urban legend or not, but it was there was a room generally that would have all of the vehicles on the wall, and it would be green, yellow, or red in terms of how things were moving along with them. And this room was historically a room that stayed green because nobody wanted to talk about the problems. They would rather recall a vehicle than stop the assembly on it. And that he gave people permission to basically stop the line or whatever, or bring up issues ahead of time. And Mary Barra did that as well. I remember one of the stories you told me about, I think, the paint department.
Yeah, that was early in her career.
Yeah.
She didn't come up with the idea to stop the line. That GM actually took that from Toyota years ago. But she was pretty early in her career. I think she was a management trainee or some such plant in Hamtramck, which Cadillac plant then. Now it's their first electric vehicle plant now. And yeah, there was some problem with the paint shop, and she buzzes up there and gets all these engineers and line workers in a circle and all figure out what's going on and just immediately get moving. I think where she really put this sort of thing into place, identifying problems quickly, was the ignition switch crisis, which is another one of these existential failures and crises at General Motors. And for years, they hid the fact that this switch had a defect where it would shut off. People were dying. This went on for a decade. And it was during that crisis, while she was managing that, they set up a system where top executives would get notification of anything that could end up being a recall, a safety or quality issue as quickly as possible. And she rewarded people. There was, I think, an intern that had identified something, and she took the intern out to lunch. She really moved to make sure people were alerting problems and not sweeping them under the rug, which was very important because these things, every car company I've covered has had some big, hairy recall issue. Honda may be the only one that hasn't. Volkswagen had the diesel problem. Toyota had the accelerator issue. Ford had Firestone tires, and GM had ignition switch. These things happen in the industry, and if you don't find it quickly, then you've got a lot of vehicles out there that are faulty and safety problems. She put that into place and rewarded people for flagging problems early in the game.
As I saw in the work that I am involved in around leadership, is she walked the talk. There was alignment in terms of what she was saying and what was going to happen. And she really, held a lot of people accountable that sort of pushed this thing under the rug, didn't want to deal with it, and were terminated. A lot of high-level people.
I think that's right. She did. It was either 11 or 13 people who were fired. The criticism of that, look, I think she did hold people accountable, and I think she really did push the organization to identify problems and to work on quality. Overall, she gets very good marks for that. There is some criticism from some of the attorneys on the other side of this that there weren't any top executives who got sent packing on this. And I think there's some validity there. I talked to Ted Solso, who was non-executive chairman at the time. He said he had been CEO of Cummins Engine before he was on the board of GM. And he said that he had a rule at his company where within 24 hours, people had to tell him personally that there was an issue that could be quality or safety related. He said at GM, the attorneys wouldn't let the top executives get that information. Essentially, I think they wanted to give them plausible deniability. And one of the criticisms from the attorneys on the other side of this and from members of Congress was that GM's top attorneys, the general counsel, didn't get fired over this. There is that criticism just to kind of paint the whole picture. But generally, she held the organization accountable. And after the report came out about all the problems and mistakes they had made, she said, look, if you're not part of the solution here, then you're part of the problem. And in no uncertain terms, she basically told the entire organization that you've got to work to find issues before they snowball into something.
Yeah. And that's interesting. You make a great point. And I would say none of us are perfect. We're always human. you watch and say, is it getting better or is it getting worse?
That's
Is
right.
the status quo changing? Now, the book is really charging ahead, which is about this move into electric vehicles. How challenging is that for her coming into this huge goal?
Yeah, you're talking about a company that's basically done business the same way for 120 years. And now you're trying to get them to do things very, very differently. She's had a lot of resistance here. Internally, one of my favorite stories in there is when she was head of product development and they're working on the Chevy Bolt. The engineers wanted to go with 125, 150 miles of range for the vehicle. That's how far the vehicle can go on a charge before you need to go back and charge. That's not a lot of mileage. A vehicle can these days gets 450 miles on a tank of gas. Consumers are making a serious sacrifice buying a vehicle that only gets 120 miles of range, 150 miles of range. And she told them, no, we got to be over 200 or we're going to embarrass ourselves, and really push them to do it. And internally, the engineers, I think, really, the reason they were pushing for lower range, it was cheaper and easier to do. And they just wanted to make this vehicle so that they could meet California electric vehicle requirements and move on about their business of selling gas guzzlers, which is where GM still makes all of its money, selling big pickups and big SUVs. And she said, no, if we're going to do this, we have to put our best foot forward and show that we have a credible vehicle. So that goes back to 2011, I think, where she's getting that kind of resistance. And I talk to engineers now who are still not convinced that the world's ready to go electric. The world is. It's just a question of how quickly people are going to adopt it. And that's a fair and open debate right now. But she's had to face resistance from engineers and other managers in the company who are just not sure the world's ready to give up gasoline and plug their cars in. She got resistance from the union because to execute this plan, she had to cut costs and shut some factories down. And GM had its longest strike in 40 or 50 years, which is a big section of the book. And then because of one of the plants she closed was in Lordstown, Ohio, where Donald Trump said he was going to bring the industrial economy back. She became a target of his for a couple of years for that. She's fighting internal engineers. She's fighting her union. She's fighting Donald Trump just to put this plan in place in order to try to compete with Elon Musk and Tesla.
Yeah. One of the things that it blew me away, I didn't even realize this was possible, is them making an electric vehicle out of the Hummer.
Yeah. It's an all-new vehicle. They're not just retrofitting an old Hummer. The brand basically went out of business in 2010 after bankruptcy. But that's an interesting choice. When they did it, I thought, this seems like a nice to have. Why don't you just make a crossover SUV type of thing that would compete with the cars Tesla has out there? They want to show a certain kind of consumer that electric vehicles can be cool. There's a certain kind of buyer out there who loves big, brawny pickup trucks, huge SUVs, and that buyer would probably never get into a small 4 or 5 passenger Tesla type of electric vehicle. It's just not macho enough or it's not cool enough. And GM wanted to show the world that you can do something totally different with electric drive. And I was a little dubious of the strategy, but they've got a lot of people lining up to buy this thing. And I think it has turned attention to what electric vehicles can do.
Yeah. But wasn't one of the arguments on it, though, that it takes so much of the resources into this one vehicle that it starts to defeat the purpose of an electric vehicle?
It is. Look, there's an aspect of General Motors that it is, in a lot of ways, a company people love to hate. And in GM's view, they're doing this Hummer because they're taking what was seen as the dirtiest vehicle on the planet and making it clean with electric drive. But then the critics say, yeah, but it weighs 9,000 pounds and it requires so much carbon to produce that electricity that it's almost as dirty as a gasoline-powered Toyota Prius or something like that. I've actually run the numbers. It's still cleaner than your average gasoline-burning vehicle, as long as you don't live in West Virginia and get most of your power from coal. If you're in most states where less than a third of your power comes from coal, most of it's natural gas or other sources, it's still a cleaner vehicle, but it does take a lot of power. That's been a criticism of it. Well, and also, look, this thing is big and heavy. In an accident, a vehicle on the other end could take some serious damage. So GM tries to do what they see as this great thing of if we can electrify Hummer, we can electrify anything. And they still get some shots at them. But it is the first thing that they put out. It's an important step for the company, and then they'll electrify the rest of the fleet over the next decade and a half or so.
As a leader, as somebody you've followed her, what do you find is most impactful of Mary as a leader that sort of sets her apart?
Yeah, I think she's always been willing to weather heat and criticism and just stick to the task at hand. People who've worked with her tell me that her EQ, her emotional intelligence, is off the charts good. And I think it is. And she's extremely pragmatic. Another criticism is that the company's been talking about this Ultium battery, which is basically the battery platform that will spawn all these vehicles, everything from a small Chevy Equinox on up to the Hummer and all things in between for China, for the US, for other markets. But it's taken them a while to develop that, get their battery plants built. They can start putting these vehicles out. Meanwhile, Ford builds the first electric pickup just by putting batteries in what is essentially its current F-150 pickup truck. So everyone says GM's been talking about EVs forever, but they're not quite there yet. Mary's view is, and this is very pragmatic, people forget she's an engineer. GM's always been an engineering-driven, pragmatic company. Her view is, look, EV sales are very small right now. We're going to develop a platform that's dedicated for electric vehicles, just like Tesla has, and then that'll enable us to build whatever the market wants with electric drive and do it quickly. And we don't care if somebody beats us to market with the first pickup truck, and we don't care what Tesla's doing. We're going to stick to our plan because we think it's the right plan. And where GM is right now, 2023 is a big year because in addition to the Cadillac and Hummer, which they just started building late last year, they've got a Chevy Blazer, a Chevy Equinox, and the Chevy Silverado pickup truck, all electric, coming out this year. And then they have even more coming in 2024. So they'll have more vehicles out there that are electric by the end of 2024 than probably any other company out there, including Tesla. We'll have to see what Tesla does. But it's taken them a while to get this whole plan in place. But now that it's in place, they've got a battery plant in Lordstown, Ohio that's making batteries. Once it's in place, they can put out this whole big showroom full of vehicles very quickly. And that's what her plan does. But she had to take a couple of years of heat in the meantime. Oh, Ford's got this, and Tesla's got that, and Hyundai and Kia have EVs out there. Where are yours? You've got this old Chevy Bolt that, is a compact that's not that great compared to what else is out there. She had to take a couple of years. And she's always been willing to weather the heat, whether it was Trump or the union or environmentalists, while she sticks to her plan.
It's interesting when you say you think that she's got a high level of EQ, which it's a space that I spend a lot of time in from a leadership perspective. And when you think about EQ in terms of what is it, it's about perceiving, understanding, and managing emotions, either yours or those around you. And the stories that you've told in the book really, I think, demonstrate that. Her ability to be self-aware of what's going on, but also stay the course, but also listen to other people, right? It's this dance between being decisive, but also being open where other people are coming from.
That's right. That's one of the things that got her the job. When Dan Ackerson was choosing between, started with 4 candidates, but quickly boiled it down to 2. One was Steve Gursky, who was former Wall Street analyst who had run GM Europe. Dan just didn't think Steve had enough big management experience because he spent most of his career on Wall Street. Also, I don't think Steve wanted to move to Detroit and run the company. He's a New York guy. But he was quickly dismissed. Mark Royce, who's now president of the company, Ackerson just thought he was too emotional. And Mark is a passionate guy about cars. He's passionate about General Motors. His father was president of the company decades before. But he is an emotional guy. Dan thought he was too emotional for the job at the time. And he narrowed it down to Dan Ammon, who became president under Mary when she was CEO, and Mary. And one thing Dan said, and actually other people on the board told me as well, who were there at the time of that decision, was Mary just had a more calm presence and more of a consensus builder. Ammon's not an overly emotional guy. When he was at General Motors, I had a good journalistic relationship with him, but he could be very prickly and very tough on his people. Mary's not a pushover, but I think she has a more diplomatic way of doing things. And they really like that about her. And I think that was a decisive factor in her getting the top job.
Yeah. And we are in a different time right now. I think there is a seismic shift going on in terms of employees and the relation they have to work. And that sort of dead white guy hallway that was mentioned in the book of being on the executive floor doesn't exist anymore. And I think it requires a type of leadership that's not about coddling people, but just about acknowledging where people are at and finding a way to get them to want to go in the direction you're asking them to go. And it sounds like she's certainly doing that as well as can be expected at this point.
That's right. She does listen. She's a consensus builder. At the same time, there's one thing about her. The tough side of Mary Barra is once a decision is made, she doesn't want people griping about it after the meeting over at the coffee machine or the water cooler. She doesn't want people taking shots at it or not doing their jobs. Once the decision's made, move, do it.
We're going.
Yeah, she had, what did she call it? One of her top HR guys told me that she hated cave people. And it was complain about people who complain about virtually everything. She couldn't stand those people. And she's on the board of Disney. And what's Disney's tagline? Something about happiness. I forget what it is. But she would say to people who weren't on board with whatever the mission was, go to John, who was her HR guy, and he will find you happiness. It was a play on her. And the fact that she was on the Disney board, but happiness was, here's your severance package. Go find a place where you don't have to feel the need to complain all the time.
I did write that down too. That I love that acronym too. People was it's classic.
She didn't mind spirited debate, and then GM would have it. The fact that the decision to really push hard into electrification, there was a debate about it, and not everybody was on board. But once they decided to do it, I think there was a meeting with the entire staff, and GM will have these town hall events where she'll speak, or another top executive. Usually it's her, I think. And they often have them at this engineering center where thousands of engineers will be gathered, but then it's broadcast all over the globe to their global operations. And I think at one of these meetings, when she was talking about this mission to go electric, she said, if you're not on board this is not the company. So I think she will adjust. She would definitely adjust if the market's not there, but she doesn't want people pulling the company back if they've decided with it.
So as we're getting ready to close this thing out, I'd two more things. One is I'd love to get your perspective in terms of being in the industry as long as that you have knowing what some of the targets are for electric vehicles. How realistic is that, one, from your perspective? And then the other piece is that for people to be able to read this book themselves, I'll ask you to tell where's the best place that they can get it.
Sure. Yes, Mary Barra wants GM to be all electric by 2035. And other companies have had similar goals. Some luxury brands are all saying 2030. I think that's pretty realistic. Electric vehicles have captured the imagination of consumers, especially luxury buyers, and I think that is thanks to Tesla. Tesla's basically selling electric vehicles. For GM to go all electric by 2035, you're talking 2 product cycles. Refreshing, say, a Chevy Equinox twice. In those 12 to 14 years, you won't have a gasoline version. Right now, they're going to do both. They're going to have an electric and gasoline version, not just for the Equinox, but most of the vehicles in their lineup. And that'll happen until the middle of next decade. It's possible. So many things need to happen. I don't think we'll quite get there, but I think we'll mostly be there. I think certain vehicles will still have gasoline versions, maybe certain types of work pickup trucks that need certain kind of power or certain kind of duty cycle. You might have certain kinds of sports cars or specialty vehicles, and you might have some economy vehicles that are super cheap for a certain kind of buyer that still run on gasoline. Because you'll still have gas stations out there because you keep used vehicles for 10, 20 years these days. Right. Those will be gassed up well into the next decade. But I do think most of the vehicles out there will go electric. It's really tough to say that every vehicle out there will be just running on a battery because the charging infrastructure, the grid, all these things need to be improved. There's a cultural aspect to this. People need to figure out that you're going to live with your car the way you live with your phone, which is you charge it at night and then you go out for the day and don't think about it. You don't need a filling station or a charging station on every corner for your EV because you don't run out of juice in the middle of the day. But you will need something on the highway system for the road trips, that sort of thing. I think that's easier to do than putting something on every street corner. Yeah. You need something for apartment dwellers for them to charge, and people who live in cities. An apartment dweller in the suburbs, you can have all kinds of chargers out in the lot. But someone who lives in Manhattan or San Francisco in an apartment, these are problems that need to be solved, and it's not going to be easy.
Yes.
I think we'll have a lot of broad electrification adoption in the next decade, but going all out, very tough to see.
Yeah. And that was my thought. And again, somebody that's not even close to being anywhere near an expert in this space is that my thought is as a consumer, it's, the vehicles are there, but what's the infrastructure to be able to support charging this thing, especially if I'm taking trips?
These are solvable problems, but for some of them, you're talking about getting electric charging equipment installed in like concrete streets in dense cities. You can do it in parking garages and places like that as well. There are ways to do this, but it's a lot of work and it requires government involvement. It requires money. Power utilities have to be on board, and everybody supports this idea. There's not resistance from any of these groups from doing it, but you still have to get them all to work together. And once it requires government, that slows things down. Typically. Okay,
so next question.
Where can they get it? It is on Amazon. You can also go to the website set up by HarperCollins, who's the publisher, and it's chargingaheadbook.com. Please do buy it. It's gotten good reviews so far, and people tell me it's a quick read and a fun read. It's not, I went back a decade ago to get my MBA, and there are some pretty boring business books out there. People tell me it reads more like a story than a business book.
It really does, and I will say that it's an interesting read. I really have enjoyed reading it. And it wasn't what I had expected in the beginning when I first started reading it, but it flows. It's an easy read. You've done a great job with it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.